Well, we've been talking about 6 things to remember when we've been unfairly treated. We started this session last week. This is the second part to that, and we described to you briefly how it is that we all face unfair things in life. In fact, we said last week as well that perhaps we have been unfair to people around us. And so everyone has either experienced it or, as most of us have, if we're going to be honest, have been unfair to others around you. And we left you with the first 3 principles in handling unfairness that comes upon our life, both expected sometimes and unexpected. We said the first thing to remember is that when you've been unfairly treated, is that life isn't fair. We discussed all of that in our first session. Go back into the archives if you have a computer, onto the Cape Cod Community Media Center under the archives, and I'm sure you'll find some of the material that we're talking about all there. The second thing we said to you as well is to remember when you've been unfairly treated is that what happens to you, what happens in you is more important than what happens to you. How do you handle these things that come your way? Because you can shut yourself down, go around the same mountain, round and round and round as you play out that unfair scenario in your head and never get free, because inside is held captive by bitterness and by anger and unforgiveness and all those kinds of things that lead us not on the right path as well. The third thing we said in our discussion, our first part to this last week, the third and final point we said was to remember that when we've been treated unfairly, that God sees all things and is watching all things. What will you do with what has happened to you? Are you going to respond in a way that shuts down relationships around you, that is cruel or unfair to your wife, or brings chaos into your workplace because of this anger and frustration you may be receiving because of what you perceive to be unfair treatment as well. So those are the 3 things we covered. Now we'll look at the following 3 things as we wrap up our discussion on what happens. How do you handle when things are unfair and come upon you and your life? What are you going to do with this? And so the 4th thing I want to remind us of and to remember is when we've been treated unfairly is that you cannot allow yourself to get bitter. The Bible talks about it as a root of bitterness. And it is a terrible thing. I've met folk who had something take place in their lives, a negative experience, some 20, 30, even 40 years previously, and they're still angry, bitter against it. And one of the things that I've noticed within this nation, which we love, we're citizens, went through all the process to become citizens. Both our adult daughters are married to American boys, etc. And so one of the things we've noticed as of late is that there's this deep-seated divisive bitterness that's developing in the nation. And I don't care whether you left, right, left, whatever you are, whatever your persuasion, whatever your political standpoint is, fine, I'm happy with that. The bottom line is that there's a divisive bitterness, a root of bitterness that is coming out, that's vitriol and destructive in its nature on either side. Doesn't matter where you are. And so we need to set some kind of an internal standard within us. And I think that's only possible when you allow God into your life. You can't do it any other way as well. Even the very best tend to be swayed because of the things that are going on. We have to draw a line in the sand and say to ourselves, I'm not prepared to cross this line and enter into a life of absolute bitterness. There's no future, absolutely no future. As I mentioned, these folk I've spoken to before in past times, decades later, still held captive. The family can't get on with them. They've never gone on in life. They've just stayed stuck where they are. It's not the future for you. And so you need to make a decision. Say, I will not go on. I will not go past this point. Not for comfort, not for security, not for revenge, not for anything. I refuse to be bitter about this. That's a decision you need to make. No one else can make that for you. Paul wrote to the Ephesians, the church in Ephesus, and he said, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice, in Ephesians 4:31. Look at that first sentence. He says there, get rid of all bitterness. And the reason was that the church in Ephesus were under a lot of persecution, and it was a center where they worshiped the goddess Diana. And so the artisans within that city were extremely angry against the Christians, because the Christians were saying you should only worship one God and not an idol. And so there was this clash going on between the two of them. And so many Christians, because there was a lot of money being made, and the Romans recognized the various gods that they were and honored them as well. That was the kind of culture of the day. They accepted and brought all their gods of the nations they took captive into them. And so they upheld these silversmiths and the makers of the idols of the goddess Diana, and persecuted the Christians. So Christians would lose their jobs, they'll be thrown out of their homes, their stuff literally thrown onto the street. And so Paul says, don't become angry, don't become bitter. Real key there for us to understand as well. There's no part of all that happens when he tells us that get rid of all bitterness. There's no room for just a tiny little 5% because of my mother-in-law, because of my sister-in-law, because of my whatever. Any tiny little bit of bitterness will grow and grow and grow. It's like yeast. It'll affect everything, every part of your life. God wants all bitterness out of you and I. An amusing story I heard recently where a doctor told a man that he had rabies. And upon hearing the diagnosis, this man picks up a piece of paper and he starts furiously writing on the piece of paper. And the doctor's thinking to himself, oh, he must be making up his will. He's heard bad news. He's got rabies. And so he asked, what are you going to do? Who are you writing to in terms of your will that you're writing out here? And the man said, no, I'm not writing my will. I'm writing out every single person I'm going to bite. And so it's an amusing story of someone who has rabies and wants to get back at those he saw his enemies. And you know, it's a funny story, but in a sense, there's an element of truth. We look to bite those who we feel infected our lives with unfairness or a mistreatment of some sort, whatever the case might be. Now, we are not here to dish out justice. God sees the things. And I don't mean justice in the sense of a law that was broken and you have every right to go to the courts and appeal for the right for justice on your behalf. I've got no problem with that at all. That's what the law courts are there for. But sometimes there's so many incidences that happen in our life, and we allow them to pile up and destroy us inwardly, when we can make a decision to move forward by letting go. We talked about that in our first session as well. Number 5, our next point to remember in handling the destructive, unfair treatment that may have happened into our life is that what you do is more important than how you feel. I think this is very important for today. I was speaking to a man recently, and he's watching a lot of the news, and he just felt constantly angry. In fact, his wife had to say to him, listen, honey, you better slow down. You're living your whole life angry all the time. You're going to get sick if you carry on like this. And so what you do is more important than how you feel. You can't live in the feeling kind of realm all the time. Make a clear decision. God has spelled out what our behavior is to be in the kinds of situations we're talking about. In many places of Scripture, for instance, in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44, it says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Can you imagine doing that, praying for that person? Why? What Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5 verse 44, when you pray for someone, it sets you up to forgive someone, and it allows you to walk in a freedom that you could not have any other way. I was talking to a person once here in the ministry, And a family member had done something that they felt was atrocious to them, and they just could not forgive this person. Well, it turned out that the family member had died some 15 years previously, and this person sitting in my office 15 years later, I thought the person was still living, turns out they're dead, could not forgive that person. And you know, they became, for the rest of the family, someone to avoid. They wouldn't invite, the family would gather together secretly when it came to Thanksgiving and Christmas time. They wouldn't invite them because this person would show up and just spew anger and hatred towards this person. And that's what I'm talking about. Jesus says, forgive, love your enemies, get free. That's what he's saying in essence. Get free from the captivity of that which you feel is unfair but holds you worse off than the person that did that against you. Luke chapter 6, verse 27, 28. But I say to you, Jesus again is talking here, I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Romans chapter 12, verse 20. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. Why? It unlocks the soul. It sets you free when you start to do the right thing. You see, all you're going to do by doing a wrong thing against the person that wronged you is just perpetuate the wrongness. When you break that cycle and you do something in a right attitude, even though the person doesn't deserve it, remember, you've been forgiven many times by other people in your life. God even forgives you when you appeal to him. Say, God, forgive me of all the things I've done wrong. Come live in my heart. Come live in my life. I want to follow you. God fully forgives you without requirement, without wanting you to first explain why you did those things. He forgives you what we call unconditionally. And so you need to forgive. And as you do that, you set yourself free and you break the cycle of captivity in your life. So it's pretty easy to see straight up and down what we're talking about as we see this. So we come to an important crossroads in our discussion today, and that is what are you doing with these things that you face in your life? What are you and how are you handling them in your life? What you do is more important than how you feel. It's such an important key for us as well. So don't bow to bitterness. Give it up. Let it go. Don't bow to that bitterness. Remember, when you've been treated unfairly, that what you do is more important than how you feel and getting back your revenge as you're looking for it. But it comes to then an important crossroads in your and my life. We come to the place that we learn when we're serious about our own lives going forward, when we're serious about God, when we're serious about seeing breakthrough come to our lives. It all starts with a decision you make. God can't make the decision on your behalf. Your family can't. Your friends can't. You have to make that decision to walk away. Walk away from the bitterness, the anger, the frustration. All of those kinds of things. When we hear scriptures where God says, love your enemies, he's saying it because he knows what unlocks the door of our heart, what sets us free. Back a number of years, we faced a particular situation where a certain lady went around and she was bad-mouthing us terribly in the community that we were living. And I felt angry. I'm going to be honest with you. I felt real anger well up inside of me. I was just going to get out there and go and deal with the situation and face this person and let her have it because of what she's doing to me and my family, etc. And I realized as I looked at this person and I began to talk to others, how should I handle this? What should I do? It came out that she had in her own life, she had been raped. She had had many difficulties. She'd lost a lot of money, was stolen from her. Well, you can imagine that hurting people hurt people. That's what she was doing. She was going around trying to fill the hole in her own heart, in her own life. And through talking with friends, we forgave her. We released it from her. We gave it up. We walked away from revenge and being angry with her. We realized that she was suffering inside, just didn't know it. And later on we heard that someone actually managed to help her. And so we were so glad that we didn't take the revenge. Why? Because all we would have done is added to her trauma, added to her struggle. And sometimes when people treat you unfairly, it's because they were treated unfairly, just as you have treated others around you, sometimes in an unfair manner. So what do you want to do? We want to break the cycle. Stop treating people unfairly, and also when you are unfairly treated, there's a reason why people are doing it. Because they themselves are injured inside of their hearts and their souls, and they need help. Walk away, forgive, release, because that's what God calls us to do out of His Word. John 3:16, the Bible, of course, as you know, is a powerful, powerful book. And this is one of those most powerful passages. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes, confesses Him, shall be saved. It's a simple passage, it's a simple verse, but when the Bible talks about how God so loved that He gave, that's the forgiving act of God, when He could have judged all of us, because none of us are perfect. We'd like to assume that we are, like to assume that there's nothing wrong with us. We're good, we're great, we're awesome. Well, just that attitude alone shows pride and arrogance. So in the end, we've all have sinned. We've all, dropped the ball, as it were. But God is so loving, so forgiving, that He does it unconditionally. And that, when we accept that, sets us free. And that's, of course, what we want for everyone's life as well. So how about it in these three final things that I've shared with you in part 2? Life happens, unfair things happen. How are you going to handle it? How will you respond? Break the cycle that has held perhaps you captive and maybe others in your life captive. Break the cycle, move on. It's time to grow further as a human being. And that starts by you saying, I let go, I forgive them, I'm not going to hold on to this any longer. When you do that, let me assure you, friends, you will find a freedom that you haven't had before. We'll be back with a message of encouragement and a way in which you can face life for the week ahead of you. God bless you.